Well, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I gathered from the tail end of the talk that you had before that it was a very interesting presentation. My talk will be much more earthly, down to earth, than astronomical, as it were. I talked to you, I think, some time back about the Copper Scroll. So let's try and pick up on that, and then we'll get into Egypt. We'll see why the Hebrews, or whatever they are called there, are doing there, and get them out of Egypt and into the Promised Land. Okay, I'm going to talk about the route of the Exodus, and this is my interpretation of it from biblical, but also from geographical logic of what kind of route they may have taken coming out of Egypt. The precise Mount Sinai where Moses received the Ten Commandments, there's been huge amount of speculation. I should think there's dozens of alternative places that have been cited. I suggest, and I hope at the end of my talk you'll possibly agree, that the one I'm describing is the authentic place. It's not been acknowledged previously, but it has so much going for it. It's almost, I don't say irrefutable, but very difficult to deny that it has every possibility of being the correct mountain. The remains of the desert tabernacle, that seems a bit incredible. The Mishkan, as it's called in the Torah, in the Bible, is the tabernacle that Moses had erected to contain the Ark of the Covenant on the instructions of God, according to Exodus. And I will show you what I think it looked like, its dimensions, and the possibility that some of it still exists today. The copper snake that Moses is said to have warded off poisonous serpents that were molesting the followers of Moses, that still exists today. Quite incredible that these artifacts could actually, as described in the Bible, really be with us, or examples of them, certainly. I'm not going to talk too much about the 2,600-year-old bones of the scapegoat. That's a slightly side issue, but nevertheless, that relates to the practice of sending a goat into the desert to take the sins of the people away, particularly at this moment in time, which is the time of the High Holy Days in the Jewish religion, the Yom Kippur, when people confess their sins and throw their sins into the river, symbolically. And at the time of the temple, the second temple and probably the first temple, a goat was literally released into the desert by the high priest to take away the sins of the people. A Proto-Hebrew inscription at the site. This is one of the most strong elements which confirms the reality of this location that I identify. And then a sacred item once carried in the Ark of the Covenant, that is a little bit more conjectural, but nevertheless, we won't have too much time to go into it, but I think that still also exists today. So let's have a look. There are a lot of people who say the Exodus never happened. It just didn't take place. It's a figment of the writers of the Bible's imagination. There are too many things which just don't work. And on the surface of it, superficially, they appear to be right. The Bible talks about 605,000 males leaving Egypt in the Exodus. And of course, 605,000 males would probably represent 2 or 3 times that number with a wife and children in total population, coming up to 2 or more million people leaving Egypt at once. And clearly that's just an impossibility, particularly as the population of Egypt is estimated as being about 3 to 3.5 million at that time. So 605,000 is an absurd figure, and the Bible has got it right, but the people who translated it have got it wrong. They are taking the the degel, the term that's used to quantify this, is at least 10 times too much, and that's why they end up with this huge number. The impossibility of the desert to sustain such huge numbers for years, wrong. It could, it would, and it did. And what most people don't seem to take on board is that prior to 1200 BC, the Sinai desert was pretty much habitable, much more vegetation and moisture around. There was a key change in the weather pattern after 1200 BC, when it did start to become extremely dry and arid, as it is now. And it, therefore, after that period, couldn't sustain. But before that, not only could it sustain, it did. We know of several large centers where large numbers of people lived in the Sinai desert with no problem from lack of water. Lack of any archaeological remains in Sinai of the Exodus. Well, that's again wrong. And this is weird because most scholars, and it actually dumbfounds me a bit, they don't seem to be aware of the work of Nelson Gluck, and more significantly, of Professor Benno Rothenberg. Now, he passed away in 2012, unfortunately, but he excavated all over Sinai, and he chronicled inscriptions and sites and large amounts of archaeological remains from the Bronze period, from the late Bronze Age, the period which I date the Exodus to take place. So there is archaeological evidence, and we're going to see one of the most potent pieces of that archaeological evidence when we climb the mountain that Moses climbed. The last point on there, the fifth point, no evidence of Hebrews in Egypt or the Sinai or Canaan for the period. Wrong, wrong, wrong. We know from work by Manfred Beitek and others that there is evidence of Hebrews in the Delta region around Ramses. The Bible never mentions the name of the Pharaoh of the Exodus, but it does mention the name Ramses, and that is taken to be Ramses, the place where Ramses II did a huge amount of building, including palaces and tombs and temples. And there is evidence of, certainly it's difficult to call them Israelites at this stage because they aren't. They haven't reached Israel. They are probably going to be Hebrews. They're a Semitic group, but they're not a unified group because, in fact, the Bible talks about a mixed company coming out of Egypt when they leave. Clearly, some of Hebrew Semitic origin. Some are Egyptian, probably. Some are maybe, we don't know, but not certainly any of those groups, perhaps Falasha, Ethiopian origin. So it's not a unified group, but the core of them, I will suggest, are genealogically identifiable. And one of the key markers that Manfred Beitek and Hofmeier identify in the Delta region is a particular kind of habitation, a four-roomed house. And that four-roomed house is very peculiar to that period and that location. And after about 1240, 1250 BC, they no longer are being built. They stopped being built. And they are identified with, we'll call them Habiru, Hebrew if you like. It's not clear what the Egyptians refer to this group as, maybe Shashu, Habiru, but certainly a self-contained group. They lived in these very identifiable, typical four-bedroom houses, four-roomed houses. And after about 1240, those houses stopped being built. They obviously remained the ones that were there, but they were no longer occupied by the same people. And the key, and there are many others, but one of the key pieces of evidence about the Exodus taking place from Egypt to Sinai to the Promised Land, is that those four-roomed houses suddenly appear after about 1200 BC, about 40 years later, in the hillside country of Canaan, what was Canaan. And they are identifiable with the same group of people for many other reasons as well. Characteristics of the pottery, the primitive pottery that they were using, the use of terracing in their agriculture, no evidence of any pig bones whatsoever. That's a characteristic of Hebrew habitations. So you've got this same architectural structure in the Delta region of Egypt. 40 years later, when they're no longer being occupied, they suddenly appear in the hill country of northern Canaan. And they are almost certainly the same people, or at least they brought their idea of how they should build structures. There are many other clues to that transmission. So, evidence in Egypt, absolutely. Evidence in Canaan, definitely. And Jonathan Tubb, curator to the British Museum, has written extensively on Canaan, and he identifies this phenomena. He dates the Exodus, as I do, to the 13th century BC. Probably Pharaoh Ramses II is the pharaoh of the oppression, but the pharaoh of the pursuit is Merneptah, his son, his first son. Ramses has died, but Merneptah has carried on, and he's the one who wants to get the fleeing or escaped slaves or people who were doing a lot of good work, or cheap labor, if you like, in Egypt. He wants to get them back, so he pursues them. So, just going quickly back, on the first time I came and talked to you, I talked to you about the Copper Scroll, which is what led me into this subject completely. And this Copper Scroll took me from Qumran, by the Dead Sea, the community of so-called Essenes, to Egypt, looking for the location of the treasures described in the Copper Scroll. And the reason I went to Egypt was because of this phenomena in this Copper Scroll. It's mainly written in a square form letters, orthographically of Hebrew, and you can read it here fairly easily. But interspersed, and this is a transliteration of the Copper Scroll, of the Hebrew letters, but all of a sudden you get Egyptian numbering system in the text. There's no question that it's Egyptian. You can see from the figure on the right. This is from the Rhine Mathematical Papyrus in the British Museum again. And the same single downward strokes are used for 1, and then you get a hump for 10. So this is 22. And this is taken as a Hebrew kaf, these letters here, the k. And they read that, or most translators have until recently, until I came on the scene, read that as a biblical talent, a kaf, a double kaf. And that's just absolutely wrong, because when they multiply the talent, the biblical talent, by 22, they get huge quantities of gold and silver, which are being described in this particular piece of location of treasure. And they end up with 65 tons of silver and 25 tons of gold. Quite impossible. So initially people said, well, it's a fantasy, this document, it's made up. But everyone now agrees that it is a genuine document. And they've come, I believe, most of them, round to the realization that that biblical talent of 35 kilograms cannot be right. 76 pounds is not right. And I use an Egyptian weight term here rather than a biblical talent to multiply the numbers. Why not? It's Egyptian numbers. It's most likely that the numerator is also Egyptian. And the Egyptians had a particular measure for weighing gold and silver. It was called a kite. And it's about 10.2 grams, not 35 kilograms. And when you use 10.2 grams to multiply by 22, you find a much more realistic amount of gold and silver. I mean, a talent, the crown that sits on David's head is supposed to be 1 talent. Well, this is 35 kilograms on his head. I mean, his neck would have been crushed. So it's completely absurd. And why scholars adhere to this interpretation, I do not know. And in fact, the items that have been described, there's 64 different locations. I think we went through all this. And some of those are describing jewelry. And we know the weights of some of those jewelry because I've identified the items in various museums. And they come exactly to the weight as described in the Copper Scroll. When you use an Egyptian term, the kite, a 10.2 gram denominator. So I'm probably, this is what took me again to Egypt. Not only that, but there are 14 Greek terms scattered throughout the Copper Scroll in groups of 3 and 2. And no one knew what they were. Why is Greek in the middle of Hebrew text? We've got Egyptian, now we've got Greek. Well, that's not too difficult to understand. The scroll has been copied and engraved sometime in the turn of the Second Temple period, first century BC, or perhaps early into 1st century CE. And that style of Hebrew that we saw and that is in the Copper Scroll is consistent with that kind of style at that period. But they should use Greek in the text is very strange. And the reason seems to be that the Qumranites, the Essenes as they're so-called, who are engraving this, put in another clue to their beliefs about the origins of this scroll. And they put in 14 Greek letters. I took the first 10 of those. No one knew what they were. There have been all sorts of suggestions. I took the first 10 of those Greek letters and put them together and read them, and they read Akhenaten. Akhenaten, pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, 14th century BC. A lot of scholars were very skeptical about it. They said, particularly George Brooks, for instance, professor, who's always been a very, very encouraging academic. The first time I told him about it, he said, "Eureka, Robert, you've solved it." But later he began to backtrack because I think he began to realize, as most scholars seem to now, be terrified, if I'm right, a huge amount of what they've been writing before has been wrong. And their whole basis of their academic lectures have been wrong. If not wrong, inadequate, let's put it that way. So he came back to me and said, "Robert, you've got to prove that these 10 Greek letters could read the name Akhenaten." He said, "Go away and see if you can do it." So I went away and I consulted Professor Jonathan Tate at the University College London, and Professor Rosalie David at Manchester University, and I, without informing them, asked them what they would take these 10 letters to read, and they read Akhenaten. And they said, "But that's strange, because his name is lost to history." But they say, but nevertheless, it does appear to be the most logical reading of those 10 letters. And it's probably what people would have used if they tried to alliterate a name that they knew the sound of. So, and there are many other reasons now when I started inquiring deeply into it and going to Egypt, going to Akhenaten's capital city, Akhetaten, in mid-Egypt on the Nile, and finding examples of the items described in the Copper Scroll actually where they were buried. So everything started to fit together. Akhenaten and Nefertiti to the right, she's usually not that small. Quite often she's figured equal height to Akhenaten, and his whole philosophy, which was incredibly emancipated and forward-looking. We could learn lessons from his philosophy. Men and women were equal in worship. They weren't superior, and they had equal rights. And he wanted to emancipate the religion of one God, one invisible, all-powerful, omnipotent God. In fact, monotheism, clearly a monotheistic ideal for the whole world. That was his dream. I could romanticize a lot more about that. He was a genius in many ways, not just in establishing a new religion. I believe in partnership with Jacob, the patriarch, biblical patriarch Jacob, and Joseph, who's Jacob's son, who was his second command, the vizier, the second most important person in Egypt. That all starts to make sense when you put the pieces together, and they fit like a complete complex jigsaw, and everything interlocks and reinforces the actual ultimate truth. This is what Amarna looks like. It's called Amarna, his capital city now. It was destroyed within 20 years of his death, about 1330 BC, and the other priests from Thebes came back into power and started obliterating all the evidence of the Akhenaten's name, of his one god, ideal of one god. And there's a huge temple there, 800 meters by 600 by 300 meters, which is vast. It's still there, the outline of it, and it's described in some of the texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls that the Qumran occupants wrote about, in the Temple Scroll, in the so-called New Jerusalem Scroll. Even in Ezekiel, it describes a vast temple by a river. This is the temple that they're all describing, the temple at Amarna of Akhenaten. And if you start looking for where Akhenaten pops up in the Bible and when they are referring to him, it becomes pretty obvious that a lot of the Bible understanding has been misunderstanding. Okay, I wrote about that in this book here. I've got one or two copies here, but the book that someone had here, the mystery, the Copper Scroll Decoded, is the basic start and description of this, what I've been talking about for the last 5 minutes. So we're now going to have a look at the route of the Exodus. Some of the most popular places are St. Catherine's Monastery in southern Sinai, but that, frankly, just doesn't work. It's a mountain 7,490 foot high. Poor old Moses is supposed to be 80 at the time he clambers out and clambers down, clambers up and clambers down and clambers up again and clambers down with heavy tablets in his arms. Quite impossible. None of the features of St. Catherine's Monastery make too much sense. So St. Catherine's is right down south here. I don't think their route takes them anywhere near there. The dotted red line is my suggested route. I don't know if it's 100% accurate. I do know that it's accurate here at Ramses, Tanis, in the land of Goshen, in the delta where they start. It's accurate here, where the Ten Commandments are received, because we're going to see proof of that. And it's accurate when they arrive crossover from Ammon, what was the Ammonite territory, from Moab into Canaan. That's accurate. That's pretty accurate. We've got all sorts of crossing possibilities that people have got them crossing here. The crossing of where the lakes part, I think, probably takes place around here in the Bitter Lakes region of the delta, where Merneptah comes unstuck, pursuing them in chariots through marshy ground. Not a very clever thing to do, and of course they do come a cropper. Whether it's the sort of description, I then tend to take the Bible as basically correct, but it's embellished, embroidered, and you cannot take it word for word literally. Because it's got a message. It's got a message, and the message is God is more powerful than the most powerful ruler in the world, and he's going to bring the Hebrews out. And they write that up with their own agenda. So you've got to be very careful about taking it literally. But nevertheless, the core descriptions, I think, are basically correct. So this is St. Catherine's Monastery in southern Sinai, which really has nothing to do with Moses or the Ten Commandments. But it's a lovely place to go and visit. This is the mummified torso. On the left, the mummy of Ramses II, which is in the Cairo Museum in the mummy room. And on the right, the torso of Merneptah, his son. And it's immediately noticeable that the mummy surface of Ramses II is dark, blackened, and that's the state of most mummies you see in museums. The mummification process with natron and tar and resins leaves them with a blackened surface after hundreds or tens of years. But Merneptah's mummified remains are strangely white. And the reason is, and recent studies on his body have shown that he drowned. He died from drowning in some kind of salty environment. That is why his surface is white. And that fits exactly almost with the description in the Bible. Loosely, of course, not in the detail, but nevertheless, that the Pharaoh drowned in a salty environment. And here we have Merneptah's actual body in the Cairo Museum, and autopsy studies have shown that there was salt remains in his lungs and in his stomach, and he died from drowning. It's kind of verifying the words, the description, broadly speaking, in the Bible. But he pursued them, but he came unstuck. So the escape. This is the Merneptah Stela, which is in the Cairo Museum again, and this is the first mention ever in history of Israel as such. So they were being referred to as Israel, even in Egyptian texts. And this is dated very accurately to 1207 BCE. So we know that at that encounter, we read it from left to right, or you can read from right to left. Hieroglyphics are read in all directions, up and down and left to right. This particular one, you'll see here it's saying Yisrael. And the determinative in front of it is the figure of a man and a woman, indicating that that word, Yisrael, is a people in transit, not a fixed place, because the other descriptions in the Merneptah Stela are describing battles that the pharaoh Merneptah has had in his escapades into Canaan, where he puts Ashkelon to the sword, Gaza is destroyed, Yan Noram is vanquished, and we know that those places, we know pretty well where they were, because the determinative for them is like a circle with a cross in. This is what the Egyptians, when they're writing in hieroglyphics, refer to a place as a circle with a cross. That's a location. These three places are described or determined by a location, but the word Yisrael is determined by the figure of a man and a woman, a people, not a place. They're still in transit. So Merneptah has encountered the Israelites in transit from Egypt to the Promised Land. And these other places are all identifiable in Canaan. So he's coming back probably and encounters these people, and he writes about his encounters as always a victory. Everyone is destroyed. Egyptians never lose anything. They always win their battles. Even the one against the Hittites, the Battle of Kadesh, is written up as a victory, when of course it wasn't. It was almost certainly a bloody nose for the Egyptians, because after that encounter, they started retreating from the Sinai. They started leaving the Sinai, where they'd been very active, mining copper in the Araba area, and turquoise in central Sinai. And they vacated those mining centers. But those mining centers were capable of sustaining large numbers of people. This is where we come to, you remember earlier on, some of the minimalists, the people who discount the possibility of the Exodus, saying we couldn't sustain people in the desert. They were being sustained in the time of the Egyptians in their hundreds and thousands, because they were mining. And there were big centers of occupation prior to 1200 BC. Okay, the Hittites push the Egyptians back from their northern territories, really do threaten their empire. So they are frightened, and they retreat back to their natural safe borders of Egypt. and they leave the Sinai empty virtually, vacant. Absolutely ideal opportunity for the Israelites, led by Moses, to come through Sinai to the Promised Land. What they left, particularly at the copper mine in the Araba area, were Midianites, who'd been doing the work for them of the mining, and Amalekites, just as the Bible says. It's not a coincidence that they happen to be there. And Benno Rothenberg, the professor I mentioned before, who explored extensively over Sinai, identifies Midianite pottery, Amalekite pottery, Egyptian remains, and, can you believe, Israelite remains at this mountain. Too good to be true. Nevertheless, it's there, and we'll see. The Midianites, the Bible mentions the Midianites as being initially friends of Moses and the Exodus people, because his wife, Zipporah, is the daughter of a Midianite priest. Then later they obviously fall out because there's ructions, and they vanquish the Midianites, push them away from the areas that they've been occupying. Because the Egyptians had left, the Midianites had taken over their site and carried on mining copper and turquoise. It was a valuable commodity. When the Egyptians were there, they were worshipping, or one of the gods that they worshipped at that place was the goddess Hathor, goddess of fertility, of merriment, of dancing, just as the Bible talks about the goddess that Aaron, the statue that Aaron, the bull, and the bull is the Hathor cow. That's the symbol of the goddess Hathor that the Egyptians were worshipping. That is the cow that is mentioned in the Pentateuch, in the Bible, as being cast by Aaron in gold for the people to dance around. Clearly it wasn't made of gold. But what it was the remains of a Hathor image of Hathor, the cow goddess, that the Egyptians had left behind when they departed. And we have one of those and several of those examples at this site, amongst many other indicators, which are absolutely cast iron, copper if you like, proof that the Israelites were there. This is Benno Rothenberg on the left. He died in 2012. He was 97 when he died. And he was one of the greatest archaeometallurgists. So Sigmund Sternberg is still alive with us, just about. He's very elderly, of course, as well. But he worked with Benno Rothenberg, Professor Benno Rothenberg. And they were excavating in the Sinai and finding definite remains of people and archaeological sites that the minimalists and doubters of the reality of the Bible just think didn't happen. And very strangely, when I've spoken at some academic venues, and I gave a talk to the Society of Biblical Literature in Buenos Aires, their international conference in Argentina. And it's the one big conference that they have every year. It goes around to different places. And I was very, very honored to be invited to give one of the keynote lectures at this conference. But some people couldn't believe what I was saying. And I said, well, have you heard of Benno Rothenberg? Most of them have never even heard of him, let alone believe that there could be archaeological remains in the Sinai. They dismissed it as just an impossibility. They've not even heard of him. You can look up on the internet and you'll find loads of references to the findings of Benno Rothenberg and the work that he did over a period from 1969 to 1989 in the Sinai, and all the remains that he found, including some of those that we're going to talk about now. And these are the so-called minimalists who doubt that the Bible has very much reality to it. They're wrong, 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 wrong. It may have been put together from memory, sure, around about the 7th or 8th century BC. So it's not transmitted in a written form. But I think we misunderstand the power of transmitted memory of events. And if what we're told in the Bible has any validity, there were not 605,000 men at Sinai to witness it, but there certainly would have been, I think, 20 to 30,000 people. Oh, and that particular number is reinforced by what Jonathan Tubb of the British Museum found in his excavations and findings in the hill country of Canaan. He found that there was an influx of 30 to 40, maybe even 50,000 new entrants into Canaan round about just after 1190, which is the kind of period of about 40 years since they left Egypt and they start arriving pretty well en masse in Canaan. There's not a blitzkrieg conquest as described in the book of Joshua, destroying Jericho and all the other. That I don't think happened. It was a slow infiltration into the areas that weren't occupied by the Canaanites, into the hill country. It was easy for them to do that. So there's an example of the Bible. God is going to clear the pathway for his promised land, for his promised people, by destroying all those there. That didn't happen. That didn't happen. Like a lot of the other things that he described, just to track back to how did they get out of Egypt, because they're supposed to be enslaved, working for the pharaonic regime, and a very valuable asset. The Bible describes 10 plagues that convinced Pharaoh that he'd got to let them go, with the final one, the death of the firstborn. All those series of events. And I don't want to trample on holy ground for you with Velikovsky, but these 10 plagues are all described in Egyptian literature, particularly in the Ipuwer papyrus, which describe natural disasters which hit Egypt time and time again. And the main one is probably the eruption of Santorini, or Thera, the island of Thera, in about 1620. And that caused devastation, and the kind of devastation that's picked up in the 10 plagues described in the Bible. And I think what happened is the biblical writers wanted to demonstrate, once again, the power of God to be more absolutely superior to the most powerful ruler and civilization in the known world, by inflicting on them disasters. And they got the ideas mainly from the Ipuwer papyrus, which you can look at. Particularly section 4 of that papyrus talks about, and Santorini was a huge eruption, probably one of the most violent volcanic eruptions of the Middle East. And the effects spread not just to Egypt, but far beyond. You had fallout, all the kind of things that would bring about the kind of plagues 1 to 9, the dying of the cattle, the flies breeding on the dead cattle, a plague of frogs, darkness from the eruption, a cloud that descended over the whole of the area and red, the sea turning red. That may have been dust fallout, may have been something coming from Ethiopia, the Nile inundated and bringing down red, which it does from time to time anyway. So what the Bible writers did was take different anecdotes and put them together and make 10 nice, very juicy plagues to demonstrate the story that they wanted to tell of God's omnipotence in defeating Pharaoh. All those plagues are written up in the Ipuwer papyrus, including the worst one, the death of the firstborn. That is also described in the Ipuwer papyrus. In section 4 it says, and the children of the neck which is babies in arms being held by their mother, were dashed against the walls by the storms and tempests. So if it's a question of conscience for you, that God would destroy the firstborn, that never happened. Your conscience is clear. It never actually happened. It's what the writers of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, I don't like to call it the Old Testament because I don't think it is old. It's still with us. It's still extant. It's still valid. It's what they wrote about to make a point. So getting back to where we were about the validity of the people being ousted from Egypt and the miracle of it, and what happened after that, you've got to temper it with reality. There's a core of truth, but you can't take it as actual gospel word for word. The copper snake. In Exodus, the people are being tormented by poisonous vipers, apparently. We don't know whether that happened, but what we do know is, according to the story, Moses mounts a copper snake on a pole, and that wards off. That's what the Bible talks about, wards off the poisonous serpents. I don't think that actually happened as a miraculous event, but it's very nice for the biblical writers to show how God favored Moses. But that copper snake was found at the site of Sinai, the mountain that I identify, because it was the god that the Midianites worshipped. When the Egyptians depart because of the problems they've had with the Hittites, they leave this mining area vacant, and their goddess, the cow goddess, is in the shrine in a temple at the base of the mountain. That is removed by the Midianites because they are now in control. The Egyptians have fled and left it to them. The Midianites, what do they worship? They worship a copper snake. And that's the copper snake that the Bible is referring to. Oh, I know I lost the thread a little bit when I was saying that this transmitted memory is very, very powerful. And so maybe there were 20 to 30,000 people at Sinai. And if you've got 20 to 30,000 people at a place and something incredible happens, they're going to remember it. They're going to remember it, and they're going to tell their children, and their children are going to tell their children. And that's how it gets passed down. And with that number of people, it's highly likely that the story of what happened at Mount Sinai gets transmitted. Of course, it's attenuated by the passage of relating it. But it comes down, and the essential truth comes down into the Bible, 300, perhaps 400 years later. But it's still there. And the power of that memory is so strong that we can be pretty sure a lot of it is true. And a lot of it is true. As I'm going to show you now, demonstrably, what the Bible reports about this Mount Sinai. It reports the existence of a copper snake. Ben-Rothenberg found a copper snake at this temple. This is the temple at the base of Mount Sinai. This is a site that Ben-Rothenberg excavated. And I don't know if any of you can see and immediately start clicking things in your memory banks and how it relates to what you read in the Bible and what we actually have at this site. There are a number of things which immediately start to ring bells. One of them are libation vessels, here and up here. And at the top, standing stones. The Bible talks about 12 standing stones. It talks about the mountain towering over the altar to God. And it does actually. It's almost inset under it. And at the back, in the back wall, is a niche where the goddess Hathor would have stood. The Midianites have been doing the work, but the Egyptians are in control of this area. When they leave, the Midianites become the control. They throw out the Hathor god. And we found an engraved stone image of the goddess Hathor, the cow goddess. which has been desecrated, just as the Bible says it would be, that God destroyed the Hathor, pagan god. And it's in a British museum. It's in a British museum. It's in an Israeli museum. It's there. This is not fantasy. This is reality. This is what the Bible is talking about. It talks about a copper snake. It talks about 12 standing stones. It talks about libation vessels. It talks about a goddess Hathor, cow goddess, that Aaron is supposed to have made for the Israelites to worship and dance around. Probably didn't make it of gold, but nevertheless there was a graven image. That's all true, and it's there on the ground. And I've measured this area, this shrine area. And the measurements are exactly the same as described in the Bible. That cannot be a coincidence. How can that be? My explanation is, as previously, the memory of that area, which is a holy place that Moses brought down whatever he wrote, and however he wrote it, I don't know. I can't explain that. It's very difficult to understand how he could write in Hebrew when Hebrew didn't yet exist as a language, not in the form that we know it. But that memory was transmitted down. And the memory of so many of the details, not just of the size of this shrine, but the layout of it, that it's rectangular, and the altar, the flat altar area. These areas are described and the measurements are given in cubits in the Hebrew Bible, and they match here. I've measured them all. I've measured them with a metric tape, and they're exactly as in the Bible. That cannot possibly be some chance imagination of the writers of the biblical stories. It's information that was handed down verbally to them, and they wrote it up. They wrote about it. How big was this? Well, my father's father told me it was such and such a size. Okay, so they put it in. And what was in it? There were standing stones, there were libation vessels, there was an altar, there was a niche, there was a place. Oh. So they wrote it, and it is exactly there now in Sinai today. You can go there. I'll take you there if you like. I'll take any of you there who wish to go. I'm going to take a group to this place in the spring, and we're going to go through and we're going to climb the mountain. Some of you might want to take your shoes off because it is a holy place. And we will climb to where Moses stood on a platform high above this altar. Strange acoustics occur there. I mean, when I was there, I've been there 4 times now. There was a party of Canadians up on the. It's an accessible mountain. We can all do it. We'll all manage to do it. I was about 100 meters away, and this Canadian pastor, I think, he had some people with him that he was guiding around, and he was talking to them. And 100 meters away, I could hear every single word he said. The audio conditions were such that you could pick up words being spoken to a huge. Can you imagine a throng of followers of Moses spread out on the plain behind this in this direction, in a vast open area in between mountains, high mountains, of which Mount Sinai is one of them. They were there listening to Moses, talking to them. And I'll probably take about 20 people. And if you are interested at all, please do contact me, because I'd be happy to take you and show you physically with your own eyes what I'm talking about. You'll see most of it in terms of illustrations. And in the book that I wrote about, my latest book, Where Moses Stood, which has a lot of the information, much more than I'd be able to give you now, and chapter and verse and reference and indexed references to everything I'm saying, which you can check. You can check all these things. I'm not making them up. This is looking deep into the side of the mountain, the back behind the temple, and there's the niche where a statue to goddess, the cow goddess Hathor, would have stood in that niche at the back, which the Midianites threw out. And it was found thrown out and partly broken. at the back of the ruin, rabble behind the walls of this. But there's something else we're going to find behind the walls of this shrine. Something absolutely, I would say, miraculous. If this isn't miraculous enough, I don't know. So the Midianites put their copper snake there because that's what they worshipped. But their custom was also to put a tent over their altar. They like to have it covered. So they put a tent over their altar. What happens now? Moses arrives with his followers. Initially, I think they have a friendly relationship with the Midianites, because as I mentioned, the Bible talks about Moses marrying the daughter of a Midianite priest. He married Zipporah. So clearly there was a friendship initially. But then the Bible starts later to talk about him attacking the Midianites and evicting them. And that's what I think happens. Once he's established himself there, whatever happens, who knows? We can only surmise. But the Israelites now, with their mixed company, it's not just Hebrews or Israelites, they take over this shrine, this altar. And this is the place where Moses climbs and has received whatever it is, his inspiration for defining 10 rules for people to live by. They're not all original rules. They've been around for some time. But he's collated them together, and it looks like he's written them down for what we're told as the 10 Commandments. And the first one is not really a commandment. In fact, it's referred to in Judaism as the statement, 10 statements, because the first one is just simply a statement. I am the Lord thy God who brought you out of the house of bondage, out of the land of Egypt. And that's not a command. That's simply a statement that God is all-powerful in bringing you out. And then we get, you shall have no other God but me, and keep the Sabbath holy, and so on and so on and so on. But if Moses wrote those down, one has to wonder, what language did he use? What media did he write them down on? Certainly not the huge blocks that we see Charlton Heston bringing down in the Ten Commandments film. Probably small slabs, rather like the kind of the tablets that you see in Sumeria and Mesopotamia. Those kind of small tablets with writing on them. What language he was using, I'm not sure. As he was an Egyptian prince, in my view, almost certainly, he probably wrote them in Demotic or some form of hieroglyphic. But it comes down to us. However, there was a putative form of Hebrew already in existence. We know that from the inscriptions that people like Rothenberg have collected from around mainly the Sinai area. And it's a sort of a proto-Hebrew. It's an evolution of Egyptian hieroglyphics. Hebrew doesn't come from Phoenician, as most people seem to describe. It picks up some of the Phoenician, but most of it comes from Egyptian. So this is a relief about 80 or 90 feet above that altar we saw, on the vertical face of a wall above that altar on Mount Sinai, where Moses would have climbed to do whatever he wanted to do. And there's a relief in white of an image of Ramses III and the goddess Hathor, and Ramses is paying obeisance to her. And we know who's who from the cartouche and the hieroglyphics in those cartouches, which tell us it's Ramses III and the goddess Hathor. They are here. The Midianites have thrown out the Egyptian god. The Israelites throw out the Midianite god. And what do they put in its place? Not a cow. It was a cow goddess. It was then a copper snake. They leave it empty, because for them, God is not in any way describable or formable in some kind of shape. So it's an empty niche, and that's what Rothenberg found. But his work on the various layers of excavation showed that initially there was a statue of a god, and then a copper god, and then it's empty. The last phase, that niche is empty. The Israelites have taken over the shrine, that altar, and they've taken over the tent that the Midianites have erected. Oh, and this is the inscription under that relief of Ramses III and the goddess Hathor. There's a relief there which is in Proto-Hebrew. It's not hieroglyphics. Rothenberg, for some reason, missed this. I don't think he actually clambered up the way I did to look at it. And there it is. It's Proto-Hebrew. It's a very early form of Hebrew. It proves almost irrevocably that the Israelites were here. I'm not skilled enough to, I had a rough idea of what it was saying, but not skilled enough to be accurately to translate it. So I sent it to Brian Collis in New Zealand, who's the world's expert on Sinaitic inscriptions. And he looked at it, and I didn't tell him the context, and he came back and said, this is not Egyptian, this is not hieroglyphics, it's an early form of Hebrew. How can that be, unless the Hebrews were there? And they were here. And they put their inscription in a rectangular box under the Egyptian relief. The Egyptians always would put things in a cartouche, in an oval. But this is an Israelite inscription showing that they are now present. Successive layers of religions have taken this place over. And in taking it over, there's the tent, the tabernacle that's described in great detail in Exodus. There's more about the tabernacle than the first temple or the second temple in Jerusalem in Exodus. It is the key structure. And in it is housed the Ark of the Covenant. I'm not going to tell you much about that this time. That's a subject for another talk perhaps, or another time, although there's more about it in the book. So the Israelites have taken over this tent and they've embellished it. What they've done is what they usually do, and physically they've embellished it, and certainly in descriptive terms, in the Bible it gets embellished, double and treble embellished, because, it's just got to be fantastic. This is on the instructions of God. Moses tells Moses to build a new structure, but it isn't a new structure. It's one they've taken over. So this raises almost a rhetorical question. Why didn't Benno Rothenberg realize what I'm saying to you? Why didn't he realize this? That this is the tent, the tabernacle, the Mishkan, as described in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. Why didn't he come to that conclusion? Well, he virtually did. He says in so many words, this reminds us of the tabernacle of the Israelites as described in Exodus. But he won't go much further than that. He goes a bit further, but not quite in so many ways. And I think the reason is that he's an Orthodox Jew, very Orthodox, from a strictly Orthodox Hasidic background. He's professor at University College, the Institute of Archaeology. But his upbringing and his religion won't let him go that extra bit and say this is a second-hand temple that Moses has taken over. That's not good for his soul. So he doesn't say it. He doesn't go that far. I think that is the explanation. I am a person who's objective, and I like to seek the truth, and I am prepared to go that bit further. This is the tabernacle as described. Not only that, the dimensions, as I described before, of the tent are just as described in the Bible. There are 18 other factors described in Exodus which key in to facts on the ground at this place.
Did you actually find the holes where the posts were?
Yes. There are actually holes in the slabs here that Benno Rothenberg described. They're still there. You can see them. There are holes where the tent poles must have gone. Even more incredible, miraculous, I say, is the fact that some of the fabric of the tent is still with us today. Benno Rothenberg found some of the tent piled up behind the shrine, the fabric. And guess what? What color is it? Yellow and red, just as the Bible describes. There will be fine linen fabric that Moses is told to make the tent of. And that fine linen fabric has been found and is with the Israeli Antiquities Authority in Israel. And it was found by Benno Rothenberg in his excavations at this place. That is, I think, more than convincing evidence. Apart from all the other things, and there are an awful lot more I could tell you. I get very excited because I think this is definitely the right place. Forget all the other Mount Sinai's, Horeb. They're just not right. This is the place. And probably the Ark of the Covenant stood there on that floor, white slab floor, as described in the Tanakh, in that temple area. I can't really go through all these, but we were talking, that you picked up on this column of smoke going before, and I'm not sure about after, because once they arrive, they ain't going to see it again. Maybe when they leave, possibly. But what is that all about? This is a mining area for smelting copper. That's what the Egyptians have been doing for the past, before 3,500 years before they vacate this site. It was a copper mining site. And when you smelt copper, you get huge volumes of dark smoke and flames glowing up into the upper atmosphere, lighting the sky at night. And that is what the Israelites must have seen or remembered they'd seen when it's written down later, as they approached this mountain, this holy mountain. It's not volcanic, but there's smoke and fire, and that's because of the copper smelting. And the Bible actually talks about furnaces at the place. Where else are there furnaces in Sinai? There aren't any. But at a copper smelting facility, there are furnaces, and there were. And in fact, they're actually remining copper because the price of copper has gone up so much that it's now economic to do it. Not at this particular site here, but all around there, a huge open area, there are piles of spoil of copper residue where they have been smelting copper for thousands of years. And that is the smoke and the fire that the Bible is talking about. It's the only logical explanation. All the other items, we haven't got time to go through them, but there are 18 different things which the Bible, and I reference either in Exodus 19:18 or Numbers 21, where Moses made a copper snake and set it on a pole, Exodus 32:8, and so on and so on and so on. And all the descriptions in Exodus which tie in dimensionally and physically and descriptively with what actually was found by Rothenberg at this site. 18 different examples cannot be just some casual coincidence. No, they are precise descriptions of a memory, of a reality. And the reality is the mountain where Moses received the 10 Commandments. Can't list them all. I have listed them all. And this is the book where most of what I've been talking about is described in actual detail. I think I've finished now. Thank you.